Welcome to Our Stories Matter Courage on Campus. This season, we address the alarming surge of anti-Semitism and radicalization on college campuses. With a 477% increase in incidents affecting Jewish students, we explore the mental health impact of polarization, challenge harmful narratives, and seek pathways to resilience.
We'll also hear from those who've left radicalized group, gaining insight into extremism and a journey toward dismantling hate. Join us as we amplify stories of growth, foster understanding, and drive change. In this episode of Our Stories Matter, we are fortunate to interview Adela Cojab, a Mexican Jewish student activist who graduated NYU. Adela is just a powerhouse of a woman, and in this episode, she discussed her fight against anti-Semitism and radicalization on college campuses even before October 7th. And you know, Susie, what many people don't realize is that Adela actually paved the way to the fight against anti-Semitism that we are seeing on college campuses today. I mean, her courage of standing alone and suing her school is beyond inspiring.
Beyond, because she had no one at that time. And she also is sharing her experiences as a member of both the Jewish and Mexican communities. And she highlights the intersectionality of her identity and her work advocating for marginalized groups. We will be talking about how she addresses the rise of hate speech, its impact on Jewish students' mental health, and her efforts to raise awareness, promote inclusivity, and foster interfaith solidarity.
So when we're saying she's incredible, in her young years, Adela already spoke on platforms such as CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, where she shared her insight on combating radical ideologies and advocating for justice. Adela really emphasized the importance of resilience, unity, and creating safe spaces for all students in the fight against hate. So this episode underscores her dedication to empowering communities and challenging divisive narratives. And what I really appreciate is that Adela is not shy from talking about her mental health journey as well, because not many people are brave enough to do that.
No, I think it's the undercurrent that hopefully will be a dominoes effect where people will feel safe to come out now that she is coming out. And I think it's so important, especially now. And I hope others will find this conversation inspiring and get brave and speak up. Okay, so welcome, Adela.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
We are so happy to have you here, and we have been witnessing your voice for a while now. And maybe we could start of just what first inspired you to become an activist and speak out about anti-Semitism on college campuses and how you got involved with the Birthright Foundation. I mean, you're doing so many things, and just a little background of who you are.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So I've actually been in the space for a while, right? My family's from Syria and Lebanon. They went to Mexico. That's where I was born, grew up in Deal, New Jersey, small, strong Syrian Jewish community where I always heard about campus anti-Semitism, but never thought it was something I would face. And, I showed up to NYU in 2015, and my first 2 years on campus were honestly wonderful. I went on a birthright trip, as most people do, never thought it would change my life in any sort of way. I'd been to Israel before. I was already Zionist. I had a strong Jewish identity. And suddenly, when we came back from that birthright trip, it was a very different campus from the one we left. And this is in 2018, where suddenly everything became Israel Palestine. And it started with typical BDS you might see across universities, but that escalated really quickly into multiple boycotts. So we had the student government boycott, then we had a faculty boycott against Israeli academics, and then we had a student level boycott where 53 student groups were boycotting not only the state of Israel, but Realize Israel, the group I was president of, any group that associates itself with Zionism, aka Jewish groups, and anyone who would work with us. So Jewish students were completely isolated. And I was meeting with the school every step of the way who kept telling me I was overreacting. And ultimately, Yom Ha'atzmaut, after every event we had was being protested, that event was protested as well with over 270 protesters. One broke through the protest line, lighting an Israeli flag on fire. Another, during Hatikva, assaulted a Jewish girl, started yelling "Free Palestine." They tore flags to shreds, hung them from trees and lampposts. And this is in the middle of Manhattan, right? Ultimately, NYPD stepped in, made arrests. And I went back to the school who promised action. And instead of doing something, they gave an award to Students for Justice in Palestine. And again, this is in 2018, 2019. This is before October 7th. This is before COVID even. And ultimately, I understood that for me, my Jewish identity was not individual, but it was communal, and that I'm responsible not only for myself and my Jewish safety, but for those around me. And that really pushed me to file a Title VI case against my school. And this is not something that had been done before for anti Semitism on a way that was successful, right? So there had been a couple of cases that tried to push the needle, but it was very slow moving. So my lawyer said, "You don't have a case, but this case could become the foot in the door." So ultimately, I decided to file a what I know would be a losing case and make as much publicity for it as possible. And ultimately, my case made it to the White House, and President Trump signed the executive order against anti Semitism after inviting me to speak with him at a conference in Miami. And that really set the groundwork for post October 7th cases that were filed against schools. So when I filed my case in 2019, I really had no idea that my case would have this kind of national impact. Then for 2 years, I worked as an activist for the Maccabee Task Force, bringing non-Jewish student leaders to Israel. And after I did that for 2 years, I said, okay, that part of my life is over. Time to go to law school, move to the next part of my career. Worked at the DA's office in Queens and in Brooklyn, got my offer for after graduation to start my life as a serious prosecutor. And then October 7th happened, and I started getting calls from students asking me one of two different questions. Half of them were asking, do I hide my Magen David? Do I take off my kippah? And the other half were asking, how can I sue my school? And I realized that we were at a crossroads at a Jewish community. Do we hide our identity, or do we finally stand up for ourselves and fight? And that's when I said, I can't just continue to work at a DA's office. Anyone can prosecute a random stabbing in Brooklyn, but right now my people need me. So I said, Hineni, I got up and I said, I'm dedicating myself to my community again. And that really takes two forms for me. National Jewish Advocacy Center, where we file anti Semitism cases. But it's not just Title VI against schools, right? We're talking Title VII in employment discrimination, Title II in public accommodations. We're filing counterterror acts against Columbia University. Really, every case that we're filing is paving a new area of the law to protect the Jewish community, not only under discrimination law, but under other provisions of US law. And then I said, okay, lawsuits are great, right? We're putting out fires, but how can we be proactive and strengthen our own community? And that's where I came back to birthright. When you really think about it, there's 16 million Jews in the world. 900,000 of them are birthright Israel alumni. And right now, a Jew is something we can't afford to lose. So if I could connect every single Jew to Israel and have them understand that their identity is bigger than themselves, then that's the goal I have. So that's what I do right now. It's a very long-winded way of saying I am a lawyer, I'm an activist, I'm building the next generation of Jewish leaders. At least that's what I hope I'm doing. And I'm also, again, a former podcaster. So it's really great to be on with you guys.
Oh my God, Adela.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Wow. I don't even know where to begin to unpack it. I think the part that really stayed with me is that you started it in 2018, 19.
Yes.
This is insane. Susie knows, like for me, because I didn't grow up here, I wasn't aware of what's happening on college campuses here and the amount of anti-Semitism before October 8th. This was my wake-up call. So to know that you've been in it and fighting it for so many years, I mean, you're so much ahead of the game than we are. I'm wondering, so from your experience, going from 2018 to what's happening right now, what do you think is the biggest challenge that Jewish students are facing on college campuses today? How is it different, if it's different, than what you've seen when you were a student?
I think it's the same exact challenges, just much more amplified. Because I remember when I was at NYU, I went as a Middle Eastern Studies major. So the people I saw every day in my classes were in the Middle Eastern Studies program, which of course we know is extremely biased. And I quickly became public enemy number one, and that was okay and understood. And I was boycotted out of my classes, and I had to take my final exams in a separate room. But the hard thing really was the social aspect, right? Because I always say, like, in your 4 years in college, you're going to have that moment where either your professor says something, or your school is hosting an event, or you have a friend that's posting something on social media, and you have to make the decision: do I keep my head down, or do I actually stand up and say something? Right. And that decision, that inflection point is very difficult. And I remember for myself, like, even when I think about my time at NYU, right now, everyone sees me as a strong leader. But after the assault, battery, flag burnings, I took a step back, right? I couldn't take my final exams in my same room as my peers. My professors themselves told me to stop attending classes. I was boycotted out of student government. So my social life was flipped completely upside down. I made the decision to stand up, and it really ruined my college experience. I hate to say it that way, but that's what happened. So for my senior year, I was taking classes in creative writing and dance. I stacked them onto 2 days a week so I could get into campus and get out. I didn't want to be a student anymore. And the funny thing is that after the flag was burned and the girl was battered and NYPD made the arrests, I trusted the school to make the right decision, but it still took me a full year until they gave the award to file my case. And I'd stepped down from my positions in leadership in the Jewish community because they saw me as a weak leader. My community wanted to sue from before, but I, as their leader and president, was still trusting the school to take action. And I still didn't want to rock the boat too much. Right. And at that point, I said, if you think I'm a weak leader, put someone else in my place who you think is stronger. And ultimately, a year passed, and whoever they thought was stronger dealt with the same exact issues I did, which is once you're actually in that position where you have to make the decision and you realize you're not just standing up for your community, but it is going to change your social life and it is going to change the way people see you in your classes and how you interact with people in your fraternity and your sorority. It's a lot harder to make that decision because that decision is personal. And it takes a lot to realize that your decisions can affect something much bigger than yourself. So I think that that's the challenge that students are facing on a personal level. I think it's making the decision to become a social pariah, and that's a very difficult decision. I think the solution to that really is the Jewish community waking up, and that happened, I think, on October 7th, where they realized whether or not I stand for this, the litmus test will be applied to me. And I'm going to have to either renounce my entire Jewish identity or I could stand with people, right, that stand with me. And the Jewish community kind of realized, yes, you're going to come out as a Zionist and it's going to be scary, but you have all those Jews who are coming out as well. And now the question is, how do we turn that moment, that waking up moment, into a movement? And how do we make sure that the students who are coming in when things are calming down as they are now, how do we make sure that they don't feel that same social anxiety of presenting themselves as a full open Zionist Jew? The second biggest problem we have is faculty. And I mean, I saw this from miles away at NYU. I took a modern Middle East class. I talk about this all the time because I think it's such a telling moment. I have a modern Middle Eastern studies class. Last 2 weeks focused on Israel Palestine. I said, great, everyone's going to hate me, but I guess it's the last 2 weeks. I didn't even have to wait until then because the third week we did a class on religious extremism and we read multiple essays about the virtues of jihad and about how jihad is actually the fight for social change and how Osama bin Laden was actually a social revolutionary fighting for the rights of his people. And when I read it, I was like, but he was a terrorist. And then I showed up to my class thinking my teacher would talk about how dangerous it is when people use religious extremism and frame it as social change. But instead, he doubled down. And when I raised my hand in class and asked whether Osama bin Laden was a terrorist, because I, honest to God, was confused, my professor scoffed, crossed his arms, and said, I'm sure some would call him that. And my classmates laughed at me. And
Oh,
that's when I
God.
became the conservative of the class because I asked whether Osama bin Laden was a terrorist. So when I'm saying this has been happening on college campuses, it really has. So then you see post October 7th, the Osama bin Laden letter goes viral on TikTok, and Americans are saying maybe this guy had a point. Why? Because it's really not that big of a leap. If you're being taught in college campuses that America is a horrible, no good, very bad place and the root of all evil, that's exactly what Osama bin Laden was saying. So, of course, you're going to read his letter and completely agree because it echoes everything you learned in an American institution. And that's the biggest issue I see on a higher level. Unfortunately, students can't really change that unless they're coming into college prepared and ready to have that fight with their professor, which they're really not. They're 18, they're straight out of college and they're straight out of high school. I talk to high schoolers all the time. I try to prepare them for this, but I know when it gets to that inflection point, they're going to have to make the decision. And I know how hard it is to take that leap.
And Adela, to your point, I mean, the recent study showed that 1 in 10 students, Jewish students, feel socially isolated and not going to any activities. And I think either one or four hide their identity. So, I mean, what you're saying is absolutely true. And I'm so happy you're talking with high schoolers because we've seen it in K to 12. Right. So I think when they come to college, it's amplifying what actually they're already learning in high school in some areas in the United States.
Yeah, and I actually, in my legal work with the National Jewish Advocacy Center, we're also filing Title VI cases against K through 12 school systems. For example, there's one school system in Indiana where, on one hand, they're having cultural fairs where they're showing the entirety of the map of Israel as Palestine, and of course, they're parroting a lot of the same things that we're seeing on college campuses. But on the other hand, in Indiana, you also have kids who are singing Nazi fight anthems on their school bus to Jewish students to the point that Jewish students stopped taking the bus. So you're completely right that the K through 12 school system is already broken. I speak to as many as I can, but generally the Jewish community is the one that brings me in. So in the outside secular school systems, I haven't really been able to work a lot. I actually had one girl. People always ask me, where do you find hope? I spoke once at a conference on the West Coast. I spoke in LA. And after I told my story about how I filed the Title VI against NYU, a girl came up to me and she said, I think I have a case against my high school. And now we don't really think about Title VI in the high school context. At least I hadn't until that point. I didn't realize it actually does apply. And I said, okay, elaborate. And she said that they had a DEI bulletin board, and every group, every affinity group had a like section of the bulletin board. So she went up to the DEI officer of the school and said, "Great, what section is the one for Jewish students so I could prepare our part of the bulletin board?" And the DEI officer said that Jews don't have a section. And she said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Well, they don't count as minorities for DEI purposes." And she said, "Well, why not?" And he said, quote, "Well, Jews don't have a shared history of oppression." And this girl, who was maybe 16 years old, said, "With all due respect, that's literally the only thing we have." And she was smart enough to be able to email him later and get it in writing and say, "Can you explain again to me why we don't have a section?" Got it in writing. And she took it to the school. The school sided with this DEI officer. And that's when we were able to take it to the department. So it really is one of those things that you look at these high school students, and the more we expose them to the things that are issues, the more they understand their issues and the more they understand they have rights. And it's a shame that high school students who are 16 years old have to have this in their mind, but that's the reality of the Jewish experience these days.
Wow. On so many levels. Number one, I'm from Indiana. And so I was taught to hide. Then I came out to California and, teaching at a university. And I was sort of hiding. I wasn't like you for sure before October 7th. But then when October 8th happened, and I was part of the DEI committee. And then when I realized we weren't part of the DEI committee and I started advocating, my colleagues stopped talking to me. And so, like you said, I had no idea that all the people I advocated for all these years would not be standing with me. And so I'm wondering, what advice could you give students who are really overwhelmed and scared about the social isolation?
Yeah, so the advice, it's a good question. I'm sorry you went through that. But yeah, that's what I always say is we always think of campus as campus, but unfortunately, campus is also now real life. So that's unfortunately an experience I hear from a lot of people who are also out there in their workspaces and see everything happening. The advice that I give to students who are entering college or who are in high school is twofold. First off, I say find their friends. And that to me means you find the Jewish community, you make sure that you have an anchor, and they don't have to be your best friends. I'm not saying only be friends with Jews in college. That's not it. Make sure you always have a support system that you know will always be a safe place that you could turn to. And by the way, for a lot of people, that is their birthright Israel group. A lot of kids who don't really have Jewish friends decide to go on this trip to Israel. They have this group chat with these people who they go to Israel with, and they come back to their campus. And for a lot of them, that was the group chat they turned to when the encampment started up because they didn't already have those social structures. So, first off, find your friends and know that you have them. And second, build friendships and not allyship. I think that after Black Lives Matter, we really put an emphasis on allyship, right? Be an ally, be an ally, be an ally. I don't want allies, I want friends. And that's actually the difference that I saw post October 7th. I have one really good friend we met freshman year. She ended up becoming president of the African Association for Development. I became president of Realize Israel, but we were friends from freshman year onwards. And when the boycott started up, she actually reached out to me and said, "I was approached by a certain group that wants me to sign a boycott against you and your club." And she said, "Here's the thing, I don't know anything about Israel Palestine, and I side with the Palestinians. But I know that they're not saying that you stand for what they say you stand for. So I'm just not going to sign. I'm not voting against it. I'm not advocating against it, but I'm going to keep my club out of it. We're the African Association for Development. We're going to focus on development." And that's because I built a friendship and not an allyship. I didn't say, "You stand for me and I'll stand for you." Instead, she said, "I care about you on a personal human level. And that way I'll keep myself out of this personal attack against you." Till this day, she's still one of my best friends. We still disagree heavily on politics. Again, I'm an Israel activist. I speak at conferences and I'm on Fox News talking about Israel activism and advocacy. With me and her, whenever we sit down, I already know where she stands. I can't convince her. I've had her see another side, but we understand that that's not our friendship. Sometimes we even set a timer and we say we're going to talk about Israel Palestine for 25 minutes. And when it's over, it's over. We drink our wine, we have our cheese and charcuterie, and then we walk away as friends. And that's the advice I would give to people. Don't try to approach Canvas as building allyship, build true friendships. And those are the ones that are going to carry you through.
That's an interesting perspective. I have a few thoughts about it. So I, like many other people, lost a lot of friendships after October 7th because I feel like they were silent, or I felt like they were literally against me and my family. So, and I know it's a common experience for a lot of the Jewish people right now that they feel like they lost part of the community, they lost their friends.
Hmm.
And I was actually focusing on on finding allies because of that, because I couldn't trust the friends anymore. So it's interesting what you're saying. And I also had this experience where someone that I considered a friend was really trying to understand the situation, and we would meet on a regular basis, and I would explain my perspective, and we would, had a debate about it. And at some point, I felt like I can't convince him.
Hmm.
And it made me feel so powerless that I stopped. I was like, you know what? I can't do this anymore. Go educate yourself. And I almost like gave up the whole relationship. And what I'm hearing you saying is like you're able to put some stopper on it and put some boundaries in order to maintain the relationship, even though there's this big disagreement between the two of you. How do you do that?
Well, I think for me and her specifically, we had a trial run because during BLM, we didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of things. I said racism is bad. I believe it is bad. I believe that there's a lot of issues in the US, but I don't believe we should abolish the police. I don't believe that looking at the looting is something we should celebrate. And these are things I still believe, right? But she was posting completely on the other end. So we had already had that practice where, she told me her experience and I told her my experience. And I realized it was something deeply personal. And basically, what I said was, I understand this is deeply personal for you. How about we just don't speak about it? And that was the trial run. And because that worked with her, when it flipped post October 7th, we were able to have that same dynamic. And it's very hard. It really is very hard, especially for people who are vocal about things because they're so uninformed. But if you want to talk about changing minds, I found one technique that seems to really work, which is putting them in the driver's seat. Do you guys know Mark Lamont Hill, the former CNN anchor? He was fired for being a virulent anti-Semite, among many other things. He was too extreme for CNN, which is telling you everything you need to know. But when I spoke with Mark Monthill, after he left CNN, no surprise, he was picked up by Al Jazeera, and he has a YouTube show, an Al Jazeera YouTube show called Night School, where you actually learn something. And for some reason, they found me and they invited me on. And when I started doing my research, I saw that the only people he had ever speak who were pro-Israel were old Ashkenazi men who at some point had been part of the Israeli government, or at least held very high military positions. He's never had a Syrian, Lebanese, Mexican, Jewish girl who's under 30. So I said, great, let's go for it. And the way I was able to get Mark Lamont Hill to actually listen to me, and by the way, they've invited me on multiple times thereafter, was at one point I took a step back and I said, okay, you know what? I want to put you in the driver's seat. I said, if everyone in the world, the United States, the UN, Israelis, Palestinians, everyone says, you know what, Mark Lamont Hill, we're giving you the opportunity to create the vision for peace and to create the peace plan, put it in front of us, and we'll do what you say. What peace plan are you coming up with? And usually they'll reach one of two solutions, either a one-state solution or a two-state solution. If they say two-state solution, you say Israel has literally proposed a two-state solution 5 times since the year 2000. We're not even talking about everything before that. And every single time it's been rejected by one side, and that side has not been Israel. So a two-state solution, I agree with you. I would love that. But you have to talk to the side that's actually been rejecting it, right? And that's where you go if they go two-state solution. I say, great, I agree. Want to advocate for a two-state solution? Great. So that means you believe Israel does have a right to exist. Guess what? You're a Zionist. Ooh, scary word. That's how you go with two-state solution. But what Mark Lamont Hill said, he said, oh, easy. A single democratic secular state. I said, okay, one state solution, a single secular democratic state. He said, yes. I said, okay, and you want to call that state? He's like, we'll call it Palestine. I said, great, we'll call it Palestine. And the Jews in the state, he goes, I'm like, do they get kicked out? Like there's 8 million people. He goes, no, I mean, like, I guess like they would get citizenship. I'm like, equal citizenship. He goes, equal citizenship. I'm like, okay, cool. So you want a democratic secular state? I said, yes. I said, great. I said, look, if you bring that to Israelis and say peace will be a democratic secular state where everyone has equal citizenship, 7 out of 10 would agree with you. Not everyone, but if that means peace, 7 out of 10 might agree. But if you go to Hamas and you say, Hamas, guess what? I thought of the great solution. I found the perfect solution for you. You're going to have a secular democratic state, a secular democratic state where Jews have equal rights. Hamas is going to spit in your face because they're not secular and they're not democratic. There's Sharia law. You think there's a right to abortion in Gaza? So you really have to take a step back and say, look, if your ideal solution is a secular democratic state, maybe you should align yourself with the group that's actually fighting for that, which is not Hamas. Right. And that's how you always have those conversations. You have to put them in the driver's seat and essentially see that Israel's between a rock and a hard place. Say, I'm willing to implement any solution you come up with. Just come up with a solution and let's see where the roadblocks are. The roadblocks never come from the side of Israel. So it really helps. It also, like, for people who you're having a conversation with, they don't want to feel lectured. At least my friend, at one point she said, I'm not, you're not at a conference. You're not debating me. I'm your friend. And it really helps if you let them do all the talking. And then at the end say, okay, let's work through this together. What are the roadblocks to that solution? So that I've seen works. And look, it's hard. It's hard when you navigate personal relationships, but at least I've seen that at least leads to a level of understanding. They're not going to become Israel activists, but at least they'll stop advocating for what they think they're advocating for.
So interesting. I'm learning so much from you because on October 8th, when I started losing friends, colleagues, all of it, I was like, I'm done. I don't even want to enter any more conversations with them. Now that it's obviously much time has passed, how would I navigate those kinds of conversations? Because the woke, quote unquote, group, which I was part of, I just am happy that I was able to come out of it, just seemed to have a black and white thinking. And then if someone denies the existence, like if they have black and white thinking that they're denying the existence of Israel, it just seems so hard. How do I sit over dinner or lunch and pretend like they don't feel that way? So then I start thinking about radicalism. And it's so hard coming out of a mindset. How do you think the radicalism, since you were in school to this day and having all those conversations, have impacted like your mental health, your peers' mental health? Because, I mean, to be honest, I went mute and it was so hard for me to keep advocating on October 8th for all of this.
That's a really good question. So first, just a note on radicalism. I actually got back about a month ago from a de-radicalization summit held by the Abraham Accords Institute in Berlin, right? So it's Abraham Accords Institute in Berlin, and the idea behind that was, how did Nazi Germany go from Nazi Germany to advocating for Israel at the United Nations within one generation and have the strongest anti-Semitism laws across the EU? Right? Again, it was within a single lifetime. And in this de-radicalization summit, and of course we learned a lot of things, but really like the key point was accepting loss and attaching shame to ideology. Basically, the Nazis had a total defeat. They had no choice but to accept the fact they lost. When they went into hiding, it became not until we can rebuild. It was, that's it. The flame was snuffed out. And what they did was they actually kept the same people in power in like the lower levels of government. The only thing was that they had purely administrative roles and everything else was run by the outside forces, right? Like the allied forces. But it was accepting defeat and then attaching shame to the radicalized ideology. The girls that we were speaking to, they were our age, German girls who are working in peace building. And they say, we know our grandfathers were involved in the war, but we honest to God can't tell you their positions. They could have had the highest position, lowest. We don't know. You ask your grandma, no one talks of it. Instead, we move forward. And the issue that I see in post Hamas and Hezbollah Middle East is whether or not they're willing to accept defeat, because Hamas hasn't, right? They'll stand in rubble as they're giving back hostage bodies, still saying it's a victory. How is that a victory? If 40,000 of your people have lost their lives, how can you say that's a victory, right? They haven't accepted defeat. And until they accept defeat, they will never attach the shame and they will never rebuild. So that's just a note on radicalization. And when it comes to mental health, it's a very tough, difficult question. It's something that I dealt with myself, right? Like right now, again, I'm a strong activist, but I wasn't really like this. And there was a time in school that, I sued a school, changed the law on national level. I was really struggling internally to the point that I developed a really intense eating disorder. And that's it. I started binging. So in one semester, the semester everything was happening. Next thing you know, I'm gaining weight like I've never gained weight before. I stopped menstruating and I had a panic attack one night. And that's kind of when my mom stepped in. That night I was at a student government meeting. And after the meeting, I was surrounded by a lot of unfriendlies, we can call them. And they started yelling, discussing things at me. They surrounded me, first row, second row, the third row were people pulling chairs, standing on chairs so they can look into the circle. Their phones in my face, calling me a Nazi, saying they're so glad that I'm proud of my Zionism and that I'm so openly a Zionist. Because just like every decorated Nazi officer, I can never hide from what I am. It got really brutal until the president of student government, Hosnia Kovar, she was Turkish, anti-Zionist, Palestine cover photo, steps into the middle of the circle. And she said, there's a lot of us, there's one of her. This isn't the time and place. She broke through her own friend group, pushed me out of the circle and told me to run. At that point, I get in the elevator, I start running back, and I was about a block north of Washington Square Park in New York. And I was on the phone with my friend trying to explain what happened until he said, where are you? And I realized I couldn't even get the words out. I was having a full panic attack in the middle of New York City. And my friends had to come and find me and peel me off a sidewalk. And after that, I just kind of broke down entirely. My mom stepped in. Again, I hadn't menstruated in months. And she said, you need to take control of your life again. So I actually went to a wellness retreat for 2 weeks because I wasn't myself anymore. I was petrified. And then when I came back the next year, I didn't take classes in Middle Eastern studies. I wasn't on student government. I wasn't the president of the Jewish community. I really did a full retreat and I was petrified. So now when I see what students are going through, I understand them wholeheartedly. It's really scary. It's scary and it's tough. But the difference is that when I sued NYU, I was one student against one school. I always had my friends supporting me, but they were always behind me. I was always in front, taking the brunt of every single hit. And now every school is being sued, and every school has 4, 5, 6 plaintiffs. Columbia has a class action, right? Students are not alone. I think that the difference between what I went through and what they went through, even though what they're going now, I will wholeheartedly say is worse than what I went through, at least they have a support system. And at least they have each other, and at least they're not on their own. For me to make the decision to sue a school when it hadn't really been done before, and I was one person suing once, it was the entire country and it was just me. And that's how it felt. I was very belittling and very alone. So whenever I talk to the students, I tell them, like, really find your friends. You show up to your Chabad, you show up to your Hillel, you write in your birthright group chat, whatever it is, and you find the people that you can actually stand with. Because maybe you won't have to sue alone. Maybe you can sue with a friend or two. It makes a very big difference.
Adela, thank you for being so vulnerable and open about that. I think, what people don't take into account is the amount of mental health issues that are arising for college students right now, for Jewish students. I mean, this is the advocacy that I'm doing about K to 12 and about students in colleges, where we're seeing it, right? Like, people are trying to gain any sense of control. And what you're describing, your symptoms are a way of trying to get some sort of a control over a reality that is so fucked up, basically. And it's heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking. And you're right. I think they do have each other. And yet, I do think that the universities should do more. I mean, this will be my next question to you, but I just want to say something about what you said about radicalization. It's interesting, the idea of shame, right? Because shame tells us that I am bad versus guilt. I did something wrong, right? The urge with guilt is to repair versus with shame, it's to hide. And I do wonder with radicalization, I mean, when you think of people that are radicalized, it's a lot of time, it's unresolved grievances, right? And right now, with the social justice and how people are placing their own personal grievances on some big social justice cause, and it's easier to say, well, Hamas are freedom fighter. I don't know if we'll get to the point of them feeling shame because the surrounding is telling them, well, you're freedom fighters, you're in the right. So even if by some weird situation we can beat this ideology and we can take down Hamas, I am worried about how it's going to still be amplified by the society.
So I agree, except I really take the protesters I see on college campuses and divide them into two categories. There's the fundamentalists who you will never change. And then there's really the human rightsers, the ones who think that they're doing the right thing. So for example, I had a student once ask me, what do I do when, a classmate of mine, not really my friend, just someone who I sit next to in class, I saw them at the encampment. What should I do? How do I talk about it? How do I broach the topic? I said, guess what? If you walk through the encampment and you hold eye contact with them, they look down. They look down because they can't look you in the eyes. If you're just passing by and you stand in front of them and you just try to hold eye contact, they will not look you in the eyes because they are ashamed. Because they are ashamed. And then you show up to class the next day and you just say, hey, how was your weekend? What were your plans? Like, how was your weekend? And they'll never bring up the fact they were at the encampment because they are ashamed. And I got to watch this in real time. My sister went to Princeton and she was friends with a lot of kids who are not Jewish. And the morning of her graduation, she tells me that all of her friends are wearing keffiyehs, right? And lo and behold, we show up to the graduation and her friends are wearing keffiyehs. But then when they walked out of the graduation to meet their parents and take their pictures, every single one of them took it off. So campus isn't real life. And as much as we have some sort of real balance on the outside, we can still fight for the human rightsers. Because how can you not hold eye contact for something that you placed your body in? You placed your body in an encampment. How can you not defend that? You put a keffiyeh around you. How are you not wearing it when you're taking your pictures with your family? So I think that we still have that moment. Campus is spilling into real life, but we still have that moment where we're able to change something. And how we're going to do that is a good question. I mean, that's what I'm trying to work on. But I think the shame is still there.
You say something that I'm starting to work on now is having empathy for a group that maybe I was friends with, maybe I'm teaching. And just even last week, I heard students saying things about Zionism. I thought to myself, I love her heartbeat. I think she's an amazing, amazing student. And I really think she's part of the group think. And so I have tons of empathy for her. And I'm so grateful that time has passed in terms of I don't think I would have been that way on October 8th or October 9th, but I know her heartbeat. So seeing each other like through the lens of humanity, I think is so important. And obviously, you developed this way before October 7th in terms of you knew this was coming because it had already arrived and it probably never left, actually. So, how do you think? Actually, I'm very curious because I was raised in hiding. Obviously, you had a strong sense of your Jewishness way before October 7th. How do you think your Jewish identity shaped your approach to this day?
So I really think that everyone has a different role to play, and I can't play a certain role that I wasn't born into, right? So, for example, even with birthright, when we're talking to donors, I can't say I was a kid who never thought about Judaism and I wasn't connected, and I went on birthright, and then suddenly I thought, because that's not me. So I'm fully honest, and I tell them I was Zionist. I grew up in a Jewish household. I grew up modern Orthodox. I went to a Jewish school my entire life. My town of Deal, New Jersey, where I am right now, is almost entirely Syrian Jews. I didn't even know Ashkenazi Jews really because we didn't really have those growing up. We had three or four in my grade. You know what I mean? So I can't have an experience I didn't have. So, for example, when I was on my college campus, I found it a lot easier to stick to my Jewish identity because it's the only one I've ever had, right? I never was taught to hide. But at the same time, I didn't really have a lot of non Jewish friends. Even in college, I tried to branch out as much as I could. I didn't stay in the Jewish dorm. I had a radio show. I joined student government. I really wanted to be outside of the bubble. That was my goal when I entered college. End of the day, most of my friends ended up being Jewish. And I still had some friends that were not Jewish. And I ended up thinking, kind of being like jealous of my friends who grew up in public schools and had so many non Jewish friends at NYU who weren't in and of the Jewish bubble. Because I said, they can really do so much more outreach that I can't. Like when the BDS vote came around, and the person I approached, I was Adela the Zionist, Adela the Jewish Zionist, because I never hid my identity. So every conversation I had with any student government senator came from the point of view of, she wants me to vote against BDS. And I was like, I wish I could have been like that kid in the engineering school that could have a real conversation with someone without it coming off as, oh, the Jewish kid is approaching me. So I wish I would have had a little bit of that kind of duality that I never did. So I really think that you should come as your full self and use that as a superpower. I never hid my identity. Great. So that means I become the face. The people who did, they have a lot more sway and a lot more conversations, and they're more effective at communicating it in a way that I can't. I didn't have non-Jewish friends in elementary, middle, and high school. So I think that that's how I found the strength in me, because that's the identity I had. For me, my battle was the one that the modern Orthodox Jewish kids face, which is, do I stay in the Jewish bubble or do I advocate? Right? Why is Adela on student government? I was only modern Orthodox kid whoever wanted to. Why? Because we had a very safe little bubble, and they were like, oh, this is horrible, but they all stayed in their own little bubble. So that was my battle. Do I stay in the safe little bubble or do I actually stand up? But everyone already knew I was Jewish and Zionist, as opposed to other people who said, okay, I have my friends who aren't Jewish. Do I vocalize my support or do I find a bubble that I don't currently have? So everyone's going to have different battles. That's why I think it's very particularized. And I do think that in my school, I went to yeshiva day school my entire life. We did a really good job of Jewish identity. They did a really bad job of preparing me for the outside world.
Oh, wow. This is fascinating. And I so appreciate your strength based perspective because I jumped into I want to be in the bubble because I've never been in the bubble. Most of my friends were not Jewish, probably like 95% were not, because that's what I was taught. And the strength based perspective that you just taught me too is that they do know my heartbeat. They know who I am before all of this. So, and then it's funny because then I did the opposite. I'm like, oh my God, where are all the Jews? And then I just like went nuts of developing like Jewish life committees and student Jewish affinity groups. And I was just like all over the map. And maybe it's not black and white. Maybe it's both and.
Yeah. I mean, like, I remember, like, for my friends, like, at the kosher cafeteria, when I was telling them about everything happening, they're like, I don't get it. Like, why don't you just leave student government? And I'm like, because if I leave, then like, they just didn't understand why I care, like, why I wanted to be out there. Like, before me, NYU didn't have a Jewish student senator representing Jewish students for 7 years, not because of anti-Semitism, because no Jewish student cared enough to run for a student government position. And by the way, this isn't just in secular colleges. Take Cardozo School of Law, which is where I went to law school, part of Yeshiva University. Our last three student government presidents, so basically every president from when I was in law school, was not Jewish. And most of our student government was also not Jewish. Want to know why? Because the Jewish students didn't care enough to run. They just didn't. So now it changed. Now the current president is Jewish. I think October 7th played a big part in that, where they said, okay, we can't let this, even at Cardozo Yeshiva University, our student government at my Jewish law school, which was run by mainly non Jewish students, took 2 weeks to put out a statement. And the statement was watered down, didn't say the word terrorism once, didn't mention Hamas. You know what I mean? And I said, how's this happening at Yeshiva University? Why? Because no Jewish students ran for a student government position. So I think that's also like one of the issues that I see also post October 7th. It's really a balance between finding the safe space and building your strength, and the flip side, which is self ghettoization, which is if you put all the Jewish students into one silo, then there's no one on the outside speaking. And if this is what's happening when we have a seat at the table, what happens when we step out of the room and suddenly we're not at the table to begin with? So the advice I always give students is to keep the seat at the table. And by the way, this also goes for colleges. Whenever I speak, people say, okay, well, we shouldn't be sending our kids to Columbia or to Harvard or to Yale or to Berkeley. And I say, are you stupid? Again, this is what's happening when we have a seat at the table. If they're saying Jews don't belong at Columbia, we're going to say, you know what, you're right. Yeah, let me step out. No, number one, you're letting anti Semitism win. You're letting them define where a Jew can and cannot feel comfortable. And number two, you're allowing these to become anti Jewish silos. You're giving them the green light. You're saying, you think Jews don't belong at Columbia? You're right. We have fought so hard, especially in this country. It wasn't that long ago that Jews weren't even allowed in these universities. We fought so hard for these spaces to just step out. That's why I differ from a lot of my contemporaries. I don't know if you know, for example, Shabbos Tessenbaum, really good friend of mine, suing Harvard. Strong, strong voice. Great guy. We differ greatly. He thinks that we shouldn't be sending Jewish kids to these schools at all. He says, if we stop going, it's the fall of the Ivies. No offense, it's not. They have a wait list longer than you can imagine. And if you choose not to go, you think you're making this big statement. Guess what? They're going to fill your seat with someone else. And that kid's going to be grateful to be there. And then that kid's going to be radicalized without even knowing a single Jewish friend. I'd rather they have a Jewish friend.
No, I completely agree with you. I think, and last season we interviewed Eitan Shatayat on the show, and we were talking about how important it is to celebrate the Jewishness and to be in that space, because otherwise we're letting them dehumanize us. But if we're there, they can't forget us. They can ignore Adela on campus, and they can ignore the fact that you're Jewish and you're a Zionist, because your face is right there. You're a human being in front of them versus someone who's not there. So I completely agree with you. I think we cannot afford being away from those places. We have to be there, and we have to be proud and loud as much as we can. And the dialectic is finding the balance of how to do that while also keeping our sanity, our mental health. So I'm going to ask you, we have two last questions that we ask everybody. What are you going to do for your own healing and self-care this week? I mean, you're such a fighter. What do you do?
That's a good question. So actually, for the first half of Passover, I went offline in that I did not answer a single text. I did not answer a single DM, a single email. I saw some of them coming in, and I said, nope, I get to answer them on Tuesday and say, I was offline for the holiday. Sorry, I hadn't gotten to this. So that's what I did this past week. I do get to go home to be with my family in Mexico. I fly out tomorrow, and that'll be really nice. But I think that what I've done up until this point was really understand that my family is my biggest strength, right? So that's one thing that when I was a student on campus, I was kind of afraid of bringing my family into it, because I thought if they saw how bad it is, they might force me to leave student government or force me to leave this. I ended up leaving all of it anyway, but I really waited until a point where it was too late. And now I talk to my mom every day, and she knows my ups and my downs and my strengths and my weaknesses. And of course, I'm in therapy, but that doesn't change the fact I have my mom and my brother and my sister. So I set up a really good support system. So yeah, what I'm going to do for my mental health this week is go visit my grandparents in Mexico, sit on the beach, drink some coconut water, and work from my computer, because the work never ends.
Oh my God, that sounds dreamy, number one. And the final question that we ask everyone is, what was it like to tell your story with us today?
That's a really good question. I do a lot of public speaking. I speak sometimes at 2, 3 events a day, right? So I don't think a week goes by that I don't speak at less than 4 or 5 events. But rarely do I get to talk about the mental health side of it. So I think that this is the conversation that we've really been missing. And I think that we can try to give students all the resources in the world when it comes to facts and pamphlets and trainings and know your rights seminars that I love to run. But at the same time, you have to strengthen the other side of them, because if you don't have a strong mind, then you don't have a strong advocate. So thank you for having this conversation, and thank you for raising these voices and issues.
Thank you so much for your heartbeat. Your higher brain obviously is always activated, but I appreciate who you are. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank both of you guys for having me.
We'd like to thank our listeners, Israeli music composer Jonathan Bargiora, editor Ian Phillips, podcast advisor Donna Fazari, and special thanks to the Academic Engagement Network for their generous support. Today's episode is co-produced by Associate Professor Susie Hess and Dr. Miri Bar-Halprin.
Our Stories Matter, Courage on Campus is brought to you by Trauma Informed LA. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram and our website at traumainformedla.org. Please give us 5 stars on iTunes so more folks can have access and donate to traumainformedla.org so we can keep recording and healing through our storytelling episodes.